So thanks to everyone for coming to our latest CQA webinar. Today we're looking at the digitisation of construction checklists. What we're going to do is I'll just give you a quick 2-second introduction to CQA for those of you that haven't heard of us, and then we're going to have a conversation style webinar around digitising your quality checklist system, and then at the end there'll be an opportunity for questions. So just a quick intro to CQA. So we're a not-for-profit. We formed in 2021. We basically made our professional group is our quality leaders from tier 1 and tier 2 constructors. We have 4 pillars which we focus on: advocacy and communication around quality, training and education, quality knowledge, lessons and news, and simplification and standardization. And we have a presence on LinkedIn and also a website. Just give you a quick website demo. So website has 2 interesting aspects. The first one is our news section, where we share news on quality to the whole of the industry. And the idea is that you can go in and you can get information on quality that constructors can then use in terms of their internal communication processes. And the second one is our members area. So if you join as a professional or a general member, you get access to the members area. And what we've got in here is we've got members discounts on training. We've got a link to all the past webinars. So this webinar is being recorded today. We'll make that available in the website in the next week. Lessons learned. So we're beginning to capture technical lessons learned from our members and put those in one place for you. Studies and research. So we've got a lot of university studies on quality that have been done that we're making available for you. And standard templates. So we've got a whole load of standard templates for you to use if you haven't got one of those templates in your system historically. So we're developing content all the time for the industry to get standardization across the business. So that's basically the CQA and what we do. If you're interested in joining, reach out. And then I'm going to get straight into the conversation on digitizing checklists. So I will just stop sharing. So my name is Jerome Harris. I'm the chairman of CQA. And I'd like to introduce Damien Quinn. So Damien is works for Visibuild. Damien, do you want to give us a...
I'll give us the couple-minute introduction. Yeah, so I'm Damien Quinn. I'm one of the original founders and CEO here at Visibuild. Prior to my time in Visibuild, I spent 15 years working in the commercial construction space with Multiplex, both in the Victorian and Queensland regions. So across that 15 years, delivered a large number of varying projects of varying scales. But obviously that was a fairly large part of the inception story of why we're here in Visibuild today. To be honest, the reason Visibuild started was one of my best senior project engineers, Sean Phelan, quit Multiplex and told me he was going to go and pursue a career in product management, which I'd never heard of before. And that obviously planted a seed in the mind that maybe some builders can start a software company. And 3 months later, even whilst he was sitting through 3rd-round interviews with other businesses, we decided to start Visibuild. And that was about 3.5, 4 years ago now. And now we're working with some of Australia and New Zealand and the world's largest tier 1, tier 2 builders, infrastructure companies that want to focus on managing quality differently. A big part of the reason we're here today and a reason between the partnership between CQA and Visibuild is we've pretty focused on the vision of how we normalise quality assurance across the construction industry. I think everyone's pretty comfortable to say that quality assurance has been a bit of a forgotten part of construction to date. It's been left to the sidelines. It's been left to someone in the corner of the office to file some paperwork at the end of the month and invariably at the end of the project to satisfy an ISO accreditation or client and project requirements.
Yeah.
But I think if we all sat here hand on heart and said, did it make the quality of the project any better? It doesn't always. So what we're trying to do is make construction quality an integral part of every decision made on a project, and how we implement our software and then helps people run their projects to ensure they have that visibility over the quality assurance they need, and everyone gets involved.
You know, look, it's been a journey. So, and I think Like I've seen so many digitization initiatives fail across the industry. My first one was when I was working for Multiplex as well, when I was on the Wembley Stadium job in 2006. And we had these Palm Pilots. I don't know if you remember those. They had this a stylus, and you had to, black and white click through, and we used them for defecting at the end of the day. But they hadn't. This was before Wi-Fi. They didn't have any SIM cards in them, so the supervisors and the engineers had to go out on site and do their defecting. There was no camera, so you couldn't take a photo of the defect. You had to use a sticker on the wall and then record it in your Palm Pilot. And then you had to come back and dock your Palm Pilot next to your computer and run some software to transfer the data from the Palm Pilot onto the computer.
I still have vivid memories of a strapped wrist from developing RSI, from doing tens of thousands of defects on the Melbourne Convention Centre development. So that was my rite of passage as a graduate, probably 18 years ago, was to use a stylus on a Palm Pilot that much that I gave myself RSI.
Yeah, our supervisor refused to use them because it was actually easier just to write down, use the paper, write it down, and give it to the person at the front desk to type into Excel than it was to use the Palm Pilot. So that was a complete failure. Uh, so yes, I wanted to have a conversation around digitization. And I think some of the things would be interesting to look at are kind of backing. So is this a top-down approach, do you see, or is it a bottom-up approach? What's the best way to start this? Because
So
obviously there's people who'll be doing this at a company level, there's people that might be doing it on a project level. What's the how do you get it working from that perspective?
So how do you successfully digitize a construction project from a quality management perspective?
Well,
It's
what support do you need?
both. Obviously top down from an engagement perspective, like we need to know that the business wants this. It's very hard to get 100% project engagement, even from just a project team, without them knowing that someone above them is supporting this change and pushing this change. And that's a big part of, like, particularly within a major business, is that cultural change to get people to go from paper to a Palm Pilot back in the day when there was massive resistance around that. And people have been trying to do this for 20 years. But to get the project teams to really be passionate about it, it does have to come from the top down from a start. And that said, you'll end up with project teams who want to do this themselves. Like every project or site engineer out there doesn't want to be sitting there doing this process in paper. They're all very diligent, they're all doing the process, and they're open to digital systems. But you still need that support from above. So they know that they're able to make those decisions and run with these processes, but also to get those in the team involved who wouldn't have otherwise been involved unless management was pushing it. But that only gets you 50% of the way there. The reality of these major projects is that the majority of the work is not done by the management. The majority of the work is done by a subcontracting, consulting, supplier workforce. We call partners who are actually out on these projects delivering the work day to day. The quality assurance or the digitization of quality assurance to be successful, it needs to be every single one of those partners doing the quality checks every single day. It can't be the management and site engineers back in the office collecting and distributing and filing that paperwork. That's not a successful digitization, is converting that process from paper to digital. The successful implementation is getting that bottom up approach. And it's a bit of an upswell in the industry, is to try and get the teams that are actually out in the field to care about it, to see value in it. And again, there's this big cultural change piece, because digitizing that paper process isn't that simple, because the worker who's out on site wasn't doing the paper process previously. Someone else was doing it on their behalf. A manager was doing it on their behalf. And so we've got to motivate those workers who are actually out there doing the works to do the checklists at the time of the work, because that's when they're more likely to ensure that they're actually building it in accordance with whatever's been developed into that checklist. And I'm sure we'll come into the topic around what makes a good checklist later. But assuming we've got that part nailed, we need the actual people executing the work to be looking at that when they're doing it and then recording the evidence. So
And do you think,
both.
if you're obviously you're selling it to two different groups, okay? You're selling it to the people at the top who've got the money and who've got the authority, and then you've got to sell it to the people who are actually using the tools at the end of the day. Is the why the same for both those groups in your view?
In the long run, the why is the same. Because in the end, if the subcontractor makes more money, invariably the builder or the head contractor makes more money as well.
Yeah.
The opportunities for improvement for those subcontractors are actually far greater. whether we like to believe it or not, a lot of subcontractors are running on higher profit margins, but also higher risks. They're the ones delivering the works. They're the ones taking on the risk. And so any efficiencies they can gain are massive opportunities for their business because they're the ones with the warranties. They're the ones having to come back to the work. And when you look at the history of the construction industry, they're generally the ones who are going bankrupt when things go bad.
Yep.
So as long as we can get the right people in those businesses to understand it, particularly those that have been in the industry for a long time, who have seen how much quality costs and what the opportunity costs are there for quality, it's quite easy to get them on board. That said, the worker who wasn't doing that quality checklist before, it's a whole new thing for them. So for them, it is educating them on why they should be doing it. And there's a lot of proud people out in this and in the industry who do want to deliver really good quality work, and they take it and adopt it, and they're passionate about it, and they talk to the next person about it.
But it's got to be easier for the end worker because rather than having to go back and get the bit of paper and fold it up and put it in their pocket and then, fill it in and then or carry a clipboard around with them, they've got their device with them all the time. So surely it's got to be somewhat easier.
It does. And it's taking the device away as well. Like it doesn't have to be anything fancy, like an iPhone, an Android, whatever it is that people have in their pocket. We've got to enable them to use that. Like
Yeah.
we said, the PDAs didn't work. Expecting people to carry a tablet, an iPad around with them doesn't always work. I've lost several of them in my time in the industry. We need to meet people where they're at, and everyone is on that phone all the time on site. And if we can get that phone in their hands working to do this, we've got half a chance.
It's interesting looking at the end user. When I was with a previous employer, we put in a supplier assessment process. And so with this new digitized supplier assessment process is where all of our suppliers would come through and they would all go through this multi-part questionnaire and they would do it digitally, which meant that it would be much quicker to become a supplier to the company. And so what we did was we went and digitized all of these 50 different checklists that we were sending out to suppliers. And we started getting our suppliers to go through the process. And it turned out it took about 2 weeks for a supplier to fill in all of these full digitized checklists. And the suppliers started kicking off because they were like, this is ridiculous. This is like, this is too much work just to come and work on one of your projects. And when we looked into it, what we found was that no one had been filling in all the checklists before. Okay, they'd just been going around it because it was too complex. But because we hadn't digitized it, we didn't realize that it was a crap system, basically. It was only when we forced everyone to do it that we realized we'd created this ridiculous system that no one could comply with. And that's the same. If you've got someone who's used to filling in their checklists in the office once a week for the whole week's work, it's a change in behavior in terms of when they're doing the work.
Would be worse. It could be that person who fills in one checklist and photocopies it 50 times and signs and dates it with different dates.
Mate, you've got to at least use different pens. I mean,
Yes. Yeah, the four pen works. But that's a huge problem we face with the digitization now is that it's exactly the same process. Is you look at pre-builders that will have pre-pour inspections, ITBs and ITCs that are a generic document for they could be used on 20 different types of concrete elements.
yeah.
And half of the document's not applicable to the majority of use case situations. And then they digitize that exact document and put it into a digital platform and wonder why everyone's struggling to use it and pushing back. And a huge part of that process is businesses have an existing system, but that existing system has to have capacity to change to suit a digital environment. If the same system, if it has to be the exact same system, rigid the way it was before, it won't succeed digitally.
So obviously a bit of paper, very flexible in terms of filling it in. I can fill it in, I can fill it in any
Cross it
pen.
out.
Whenever I like, I can cross things out, I can hand it to you. You can fill a bit in, we can give it to Johnny. Johnny can fill a bit in. It's a very flexible way of completing information. How do you go from something that is so ubiquitous and so simple to a digital way of working? What's the first conversation that you're going to have when you're digitizing the process?
It's actually a mindset shift because what made that paper process so simple is also what's not helping to improve the quality of projects. By using a checklist, for example, that can be used for multiple different elements, it means it's not specific enough to the works that are actually being conducted out on site. And so it's a process of collecting certain information to satisfy an exercise.
Yeah.
And digitizing that, yes, it's 100% going to make that more painful because the checklist is a catch-all. It's there to cover everything. when we're onboarding customers, we assemble what's called a working group where we will work with that business over 3+ months often to completely redo their entire checklist process. Because if otherwise, you'll end up with situations like that where it won't work. Whereas we'll end up with 18 to 20 different inspection templates at a high level for concrete elements, for example, just to keep using that specific example, that all reference back to a core revision control document, but they're specific. They're then made specific on the projects to suit the exact actual elements so that when people are actually out on the projects completing these inspections, they're completing them with information that's relevant to the works they're doing, not to a standardized document that came from a document library at head office that was built 12 years ago.
So from to that extent, you'd look at a checklist at an enterprise level to start off with,
Yes.
but then the proposal would be to allow projects to modify that. So they'd say, well, obviously you've given me a concrete checklist, that's good, but we're using green concrete on this job, therefore we need to have some extra questions in here or an additional step for a check in that. So is the idea then that you keep a certain amount of consistency across the business in terms of what the business needs to report upwards, but you allow the projects to flex below that, or do you allow the projects to change anything? How's that? How do you manage those conflicting kind of requirements?
A really complicated question depending on the client and the project type. So I'm going to give two answers that don't go for half an hour.
Yeah.
The first one being in the ideal situation is that the majority of builders we're working for have ISO accredited systems and they need to have something that's traceable and auditable to reference back to. And in those situations in particular, you have, like you described, the company level or enterprise level template library that is audited, it's approved for use as part of their ISO system, and it effectively sets the minimum standard of expectations on the project. Those then get taken to a project level. And in our system, they then carry 2 revisions. So at company level, they have 1 revision. At project level, they have 2 revisions. So you can always see the reference back to the company level. Any changes from that point forwards are then audit logged. So you can then reference any changes that are made from that audited document, which is really, really important when you're managing that process. Because at project level, you are going to need to delete things that are irrelevant to an inspection, but you need to be able to audit what's been deleted. More importantly, they're adding. So they're adding additional tasks and information or requirements relevant to the project itself, which is through the review process of specifications on the job. And so an ideal perfect world is they're taking their standardized checklist, which is covering off their ISO, it's covering off lessons learned and all the other problems they've had previously in the industry and the best practice they know they should be delivering. Then they're reviewing the project specifications, brief, drawings, documents, PPA,
Adding on below that.
and adding to it and making it project specific or modifying requirements to add additional information, referencing approved products, things like that, adding additional like required fields for where evidence needs to be captured, attaching documents so that they know what they need out in the field. That 2-part process is really important. There is a flip side to this. There are certain examples, particularly more in the infrastructure space, where the true ITP, ITC processes run. And this is the ITP, ITC relationship is a conversation that's up for debate and seems to be run differently between every state and every project and every company. But particularly on those infrastructure projects, they will often start from scratch and it will be based on the specification as dictated by the client. And so the client will have minimum standards regarding the ITP. Obviously, the general contractor will have their expectations of what they need to see, and then you end up with effectively an inspection template that's created at project level, but it's more complicated now because you've got to make sure you're satisfying both those really stringent client requirements, but you've also got to maintain your own accredited system internally.
Yeah. So in terms of the first example, when you're looking at doing a bit like, let's say Harris new construction company, was working with Visibuild, you'd come up with a checklist that was 70% that covered the majority of your concrete work, and then you'd allow the projects then to work on the extra 30% for their own particular specification requirements. And then
to add more complication to that example, you then have every project has different subcontractors, and the different subcontractors are performing different elements of work. So you may have like a full FRP contractor who's doing the form, the rear, the pour, or you're breaking packages down. And so different sections of that eventual ITC will be delegated out to different trades, which is why they again have to be different for every project.
So sticking with the first example, so let's say we've got the Harris concrete checklist. Would you have one for elevated units that had formwork inspections, one for slab on ground, one for vertical units because of obviously the formwork requirements? Or would you have one for everything that you try and wrap everything in?
No, and you'll end up with a different inspection for, you might have five different inspection for piles, depending on the type of the project, where you
Right.
have individual requirements between test piles, different depths, different concrete thicknesses. We then go into pad footings, capping beams, slab on ground, suspended slabs, PT suspended slabs, depending on the building type. When you've got heavy services congestions in slabs, you often have a different inspection for that as well. Then you obviously get the vertical elements. So there will be ones specific to a jump form, specifics to columns, specifics to precast panels that are then wet jointed into in situ elements. They will all have different templates. Sometimes they're born from the same vertical enterprise or company level inspection template, maybe duplicated 3 times in a project and converted into a jump form template versus a column template versus a wet joint template, for example, and modified to suit. But yes, there should be different inspections for each, or if different template types for every one of those instances.
One of my pet hates is NAs on checklists. Like if I had my way, I'd never have an NA on a checklist ever again. Because if you're putting NA against a bunch of items on a checklist, it's a sign that you haven't really understood the process and made it specific enough to that element. And all you do is when you look at checklist after the event and someone's gone NA against stuff, unless they've gone through and put a really detailed explanation as to why it's NA, you don't know whether they just decided not to do it or you just
This is actually a contentious debate we have all the time, both internally and with some customers. Perfect. Well, we never used to enable people to mark things as NA in the product. We actually introduced the ability to mark things as NA because what we ended up discovering is that you can't identify where you've got a problem with your inspection template unless you can find where someone's marked it as NA. Whereas previously, if you couldn't mark it as NA, people would just find a way to close it. So you
And
get
just go yes against it or whatever instead of
that's
going
it. You'd
because
get
they
this
can't go
false sense
past
of
it.
security that everything's perfect. Whereas we then enable NA, and then people are looking at projects going, why is 10% of our checks not applicable? Then they can drill into them and find out that they needed to spend more time building out those inspections.
So it's like people putting other at the bottom of a drop down. You can
Yeah.
actually, well, what are people putting in for the others? And then you can add it to the drop down values effectively as you go through.
That's right. You've
That
got to
makes
you've got to
sense.
be able to identify, and that's again the power of digital. You couldn't see what was not applicable on paper before, whereas we can give you a report across an entire business of who's marking the most items as not applicable.
Yeah, I mean, historically, you'd only know something had been ticked as NA when you went back 3 years later to find out who'd done the inspection and found out that someone had put NA against a bunch of different things.
And that critical bit of information you were looking for was not applicable.
Yeah. So whereas now you can actually go and get that. Okay, that makes sense. And then so looking at third party sign-offs, so let's say or subcontractor sign-offs. So let's say we're doing this a concrete checklist and we've got third party sign-off from the steel fixer. We've got concrete records coming in. Do you need to build the steel fixers checklist in as well? Do you take the checklist from them and build it in, or do you recommend that construction companies impose the steel fixing checklist onto the steel fixer? How does that sit up?
Again, both. The perfect world for us is that when a subcontractor, for example, gets brought into Visibuild, we'll say, they have that same concept of a company library that the paying general contractor has.
Yeah,
What that means is that subcontractor, because we also have ISO accredited subcontractors. So you look at like our services trades in particular in the industry, they have their own ISO accreditations to maintain and manage. And we've actually seen issues in the past where builders have made a subcontractor do their own inspection, not the subcontractors. That subcontractor's then gone and got a non-conformance on their ISO audit later in the year.
yeah,
So the perfect world is we need to empower these subcontractors to be thinking about it the same way as the general contractor, whereby they have their own library of standard templates. Again, their lessons learned and their continuous improvement from their projects goes into that standard library. Those templates are then brought down to a project and live in the same environment as the general contractor or Harris Con in this situation's templates on that project, and they're linked together. And so obviously, they'll go through a review process. So the general contractor will review this steel fixes template as it comes in and say, no, you need to add this, you've missed this. They can see where they've made it project specific and what changes they've made. The two get linked together. So when Harris Con's concrete pour goes live, the steel fixes inspection also goes live, and there's a reference between the two. There are certain situations where you've got what do they say? The worker and their dog, like a small business
Yeah.
that just doesn't have the capacity to have this. And in that situation, the builder should be providing them with their own inspections to ensure that they're getting the quality they're expecting, because it can be very hard to expect those smaller businesses to be able to work to the level of expectation that these larger general contractors will have.
Yeah, most of the big builders have past ITPs or template ITPs that they can make available to contractors that are on that end of the size spectrum.
We also see the other side of doing both, particularly with waterproofing, for example. So the subcontractor will be expected to do their own waterproofing inspection, but the general contractor will also do effectively often identical
Yes.
inspection, as because there've just been so many historical issues in that space. The other example is reinforcement, because you'll have the trade doing theirs. You'll then have an independent engineer reviewing and the general contractor reviewing and closing out any items raised by that independent engineer.
So are they linked checklists? Is it a single checklist that gets filled in? Because there's different ways of
No, they're linked checklists. And so you can't, the problem with trying to have everything within one checklist is then it becomes this big behemoth. From a general contractor's perspective, you need to be able to see all of the other parties within that high level checklist.
Yeah.
As a subcontractor, though, you don't need to see all that noise. There are certain situations in like a pre-sheet, for example, where you might need to be able to see the status or of other trades quality checklists, but generally they just need to see the works they're looking after. And so it gives a different view to different parties depending on what they're managing. The other side to that is when you've got those consulting engineers who are completing reviews, particularly in the pre-pour and that pre-sheet process, they may have a small inspection to complete that might be blank, where they raise their items to be rectified through the process.
Yeah.
But they're also a reviewer of the overall pre-pour process because they need to sign off too. So in which case they have their ability to raise issues, but they also have the ability to view everything that's happening as part of that inspection process.
Well, they need to know that everything up to them has been complete because they're the whole point approver for the pour effectively.
And again, this is one of the frustrations I've had with the industry in the past is like, we don't allow wet signatures because people just pass their phone around and get somebody to sign it off. Whereas there's no reason you can't review it in the platform. But if you're made a reviewer of something, you can see everything before that point because that's all contextual to your review process.
Because you need to know that everybody else in the chain has done their piece of work before it comes to you.
Otherwise, what are you signing off?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So it's actually important to understand the process that it's not just, because a piece of paper can be filled out of sequence, it can be given to anybody, anyone can fill it in. But when you're going digital, one of the challenges is going to be to understand the stages of the process all the way through from formwork, through steel fixing, through inspections, hold points, concrete pouring, finishing, etc., so that you can break that down into a series of independent checklists that are connected but also separate so that the individual parties can manage their own work in their own.
It really forces people to think about how they're building their project. And general contractors, project managers are incredibly good at thinking and building the project up in their head of how we're going to deliver this project. They obviously spend a lot of time building up programs for how it's built, but getting them heavily involved in the quality process and how they're going to set the inspections up and how the subcontractors link in and when the consultants come in, who signs that whole point off. That process that had often been done by a third party or someone else that sits in the office, if we can get the project leadership team to really be thinking about when they're setting it up, they do. It really makes them think about how they're going to build this, how they're going to get everyone to sign it off, and then we end up with those better quality checklists because they've been involved in that whole process.
It must actually, it must be interesting to force people to actually understand how things are sequenced, what follows what, do things happen in parallel, are they in series? How does the work go?
Does it matter if it happens out of sequence? Is the other one too, is that it happens all the time. One trade won't turn up and you need the next trade to start. Is that okay that those works happen out of sequence? The other contentious one we have often is, can you skip a whole point? Should the system enable someone to be able to do a task that's after a whole point when the whole point hasn't been completed?
Even asking that question, I'm expecting like lightning bolts to be coming from above to strike you dead on a quality call. But yeah.
But let's be honest, were we skipping the whole point on the paper?
Probably. Yeah.
And again, it's a little bit like the not applicable one is we do enable you to skip a whole point. It forces you to write a reason down, and it obviously marks it as a permanent statistic against that inspection that the whole point was skipped. But if you don't enable that, you would never have known that the works are being done out of sequence or that the whole point was going to be skipped. Whereas now you've got to
Many years ago, I was doing an inspection on a site in Sydney, and they were signing off the whole point, and at the other end of the concrete pour, they were still fixing. It was a slab on ground. They were still fixing up the formwork at the other end of the point. I'm like, how are you signing that off? Because I can still see that the work's like, oh no, it's going to be done. It's all right. This is the third one we've done. It's all going to be good. But it's
Yeah.
very interesting. The more you control the process, the more the risk is that if something doesn't get done, then the next process can't commence.
And it's a really hard, like it's a big part of the change management process is to get people to look at this differently because everyone's first answer to like, can you skip a whole point is no, it
Yeah.
has to, absolutely has to be
Work
fixed.
must stop.
Can you do works out of sequence? No, they have to be done in sequence. But our answer to that is to kind of challenge that narrative to say, well, let's let them do it, but record when they're doing, fully audit log what they're doing, and then that way we can drill in and find out why they're doing it. And that's really important is that when it was on paper, you didn't have that opportunity to interrogate why a process wasn't being done correctly. You didn't even know.
Yeah.
Whereas by digitizing it, it's almost like we have a responsibility now to highlight that information because, well, you can now see that the whole point's getting skipped. You can see who's getting skipped. And it turns out the engineer is just not turning up on time for their inspections. That's a problem that can be fixed.
So this is like your NA effectively. It's about the data as opposed to locking the process into some super rigid process that can never be deviated. Because if you lock it, then things stop.
Yeah.
Whereas if you get data, then you recognize that people will be playing, a bit fast sometimes, but at least you can identify when that's happening and learn why that's happening.
And you can't innovate without making mistakes. And so you've got to give people enough flexibility to be able to make a mistake, but also then be able to learn from it. And then learning from that means you'll then now improve your inspection template at a company level to make sure that that whole point is not going to get skipped next time. You now know what needs to be managed to ensure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, and there's obviously, I mean, also if you look at when you're in fit out as well, some of the contractors will drive the other contractors to do their work. So the drywall subby, for instance, they want to be sheeting as much as possible because they want to get in there and sheet. And so they'll be battering the services subbies to get those pre-sheet sign-offs in and done so they can get that handed over and done that. So by actually creating the visibility over that, you then create sort of like it's like a game. It's a tension on the project to keep it driving, driving, driving.
Well, and previously the drywall contractors, and particularly in this commercial example, they didn't know what the services were in the wall. Like if we're talking about simple like apartment style developments where it's the same thing apartment after apartment, the drywall contractors get an idea of what should be there. Is that the right approach? No.
Mm,
When we're talking about super complex projects in data centers and hospitals,
mm,
every single wall is different. Every
different.
services
Yeah.
trade sign off is different. And that's why those inspections need to be built up specific for the locations. But also in those situations, providing the drywall contractor, the ceilings and partitions contractor with visibility over all of those services trades. So they can sit there and it gives another person an opportunity to raise that red flag. So when the general contractor supervisor is not there to confirm that this peculiar medical gas hasn't been roughed into this wall, well, the ceilings and partition contractor can just sit there straight up and go, I can see there's a services trade here that has not signed off.
Yeah.
At least they can then raise the red flag before it goes in. And we've all been there. It gets sheeted and you rip the walls down and go and rough that trade in that you'd forgotten about. But
Yeah.
if you're thinking ahead, you're planning ahead to the project, you're building it specific to the job, you can catch that. And that's where the real money saving opportunity is
And
too.
then the visibility means that you're not having to come back and pull stuff down, or you've got absolute clarity of what has been signed off across the entire job, rather than having to go and look at particular sheets in particular rooms in order to get it. And you can get a photo of your wall pre-sheet. You can see what's in there and what's not in there straight away.
And the crazy thing about that is that now we'll see pre-sheets of a single room with 200 plus attachments in it because you've had 7 different services trades, a CMP trade, and the builder's supervisor taking photos through their own individual process, but it's all linked together. And so you end up with this enormous amount of information relevant to that room. And it's like, it'd be nice to just be able to have everyone walk around with a 3D camera taking snapshots of every room. But the reality is, if you just get the people doing the checks to record that information as they go, you're actually getting the snapshots in real time at the time of the event. The plumber finishes roughing in, grabs their phone out of their pocket and takes
Bang,
20 photos of the room. Done.
done.
Easy. And that gets multiplied on top of each other. And it's the same thing for the pre-pour process. I was doing a review with a builder yesterday. We went across 7 of their projects, and it was incredible. The last concrete pour on all 7 of those projects that they were just progressing right now, whether it was verticals or suspended slabs, slab on ground, had every single one of them had more than 300 attachments to pre-pour element
That's a lot
alone.
of data.
It's an enormous amount of data, but it's also just that evidence you need to give confidence. Like we've all been there later. Where's the Rio in this? We need to core a hole here. It's so much easier now to find that information, but everyone also has confidence that it's been built right because every trade has documented evidence that they've completed their works correctly.
Yeah, effectively, like, they say a photo's 1,000 words. If you want confirmation, in the old days when you want a bit of paper, it was like 40 mil cover, tick.
Well, it's your word. It's,
I
it's
mean,
your word that it's done right, but we all know, well, what's your word worth?
yeah, and then when it comes down to it, if anyone wants to come back and says, "What's the cover 40 mil?" Yes, I've got a tick on the checklist that says that it's done.
The
You've
X-ray
got a photo,
contractor paid another fee to go out and scan another slab.
yeah, another cover meter check. But with a photo, you can actually get a photo, with some sort of a gauge, a 40 mil gauge, and show that the cover is good, and each side of the pour to show that you're getting your cover.
And the waterproof is a perfect example of that, like moisture checks beforehand, the thickness gauge or the wet film thickness gauge when the waterproofing is actually down.
Yeah.
You can then do the check post to actually confirm the micrometer thickness of the actual waterproofing to make sure it's down. All of that information gets done in every single
So
location
would
and
you would
recorded.
you would you put that in as a requirement in the checklist? Take a photo of this element
Yep,
as a
literally
line item.
the comb in the waterproofing,
Yeah.
photo of it. It gets date and time stamped, so they know they're not using the same photo over and over again.
Yeah.
Same thing for the moisture content reading. Sometimes you'll make them take 3 photos so we can actually see where you've done the reading. There's no
Take
taking
a
photos.
photo of the product to show that it's in date. Take a photo of it being going down. Take a photo of the DFT or whatever you're using for your thicknesses.
If you build the software right, there's taking the photos is quick.
Yeah. And again, taking a photo is as easy as ticking something on the checklist effectively these days with phones. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting because so much of what we build is covered up, and you're really relying on a tick on a checklist that something was done correctly. Whereas if you've got a photo or a video, you've got some really interesting evidence that something was done right.
Video is another really good one. It's a really good way to really quickly capture information. Phones record videos of incredibly high quality now. You can take a quick video of an area, and again, well, if a photo's 1,000 words, a video must be 10,000.
I remember back in the day, when you wanted to take a photo, you had to go and get the digital camera from the front desk, take it out on site and get a photo.
Kodak.
Yeah, take it back, take the massive card out and plug it into your card reader. Whereas now you've got these amazing cameras. Everyone's got them on their phones, so it's a fantastic way of capturing data. Yeah, it's interesting from a digitization perspective in terms of the capability. What are some of the big pitfalls that you've seen in terms of, I'm obviously not just in terms of Visibuild, but in terms of your history of
Tick
putting
and
digital?
well, the biggest risk with going digital is tick and flicks. It's keeping that same mindset you had previously and implementing that in a digital platform. And we literally see it. We have competitors that will advertise the ROI being the time saved to complete the checklist. Like the reality is, if you're using Visibuild and doing it properly, you're spending more time in there than you were previously, than you were doing your quality previously, because you've got more people involved in the process. But you should get a better quality outcome so that it pays for itself. The ROI is there. But others will say, well, we're going to save your teams 15 hours a week of completing checklists because now they just do this. Tick, 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 tick,
But
tick.
that's fake because they're not actually on site doing the checklist. They're doing
No,
it at the desk, like at the end of the day.
exactly. And it's like not all the parties are involved. And so a heap of that. And I think everyone's been guilty of it. If the paper process was frustrating, so let's digitize it. Like that's surely the answer to make the process less frustrating. But everyone, in my opinion, I think needs to consider whether their paper process or existing process is fit for purpose anyway,
Yeah.
and then look at how that gets implemented digitally, because there's no point in just digitizing what you have.
Yeah,
The other, The other pitfalls, I think, is engagement from all of the parties. We still have to use the carrot and the stick approach to get people engaged at a project level. Like you'll get the contractors, head contractor on board, your subcontractors on board, no problem. But then consultants, we've got to make sure that the requirements to record this information digitally is included in their novated consultant agreement, or they'll just refuse to do it because they still want to be able to do it on paper and photocopy it back in the office. So it's going to take time to get everyone up to speed and doing it properly.
It's interesting. About, I don't know, about 13 years ago, I was working for another major contractor, and we brought in this project mobility system where we were going to revolutionize engineering quality. And as part of it, I had to go and do a time and motion study. So I went and spent a day following a foreman from pre-start through to the end of the day, and a day following an engineer. And the theory was that our people were spending lots of time going from site back to the office to get information and record information. But what I actually found was that people weren't recording any information on site whatsoever. They were waiting until they got back, and they were capturing bits and bobs and notes in diaries and all sorts of stuff. And then at the end of the day, they were going back and they were copying things and marking up drawings and filling in checklists as a kind of, as a record 6 or 7 hours after they'd done the work. And that our people were off site from 3 till 5 because they had to go back and do the paperwork.
And do it all. Well, and like well, the study to a degree was right. Like I used to remember for me to get from my desk to the workplace, like because these projects are so big, it could be 30 to 45 minutes. And
Yeah.
so you're only going to do that twice a day. Like if you forget something in the office, it's staying in the office until the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, you get your steps up, but but that was a real eye opener to me because I assumed that people were, gathering a kind of bunch of folders and checklists, and that was with them all the time on site. But the reality was they were just winging it and having a go, and then they were going back and filling it in later. So that's obviously something that having a digital access means you can capture that real time. Uh, have you had any pushbacks from any groups within construction companies on using digital tools?
Um, there's complicated ones around using devices and personal devices. Not an enormous amount of pushback, but there's certain regions where the union is not wanting workers to actually use their personal device for work because it's a personal device versus a work device. And so we've had
Yep.
situations where subcontractors have had to provide particular workers with, say, tablets in order to digitize the process. And that's a little bit of a frustrating one, but we can also understand it. It's a personal device. It's there for personal use, and so that's perfectly reasonable. Not really from other parties. Consultants have probably been the hardest to get to adopt. Like we've got some incredible consultants that use the product every single day, but you've got others that refuse to change. And I do think there's a bit of a risk and contractual issue there that needs to be resolved in the industry generally between the way that risk transfer between the general contractor and the consultant works. I think we need to encourage a more collaborative approach around that. And we're going to need more than digitisation to fix that
Well,
problem.
same as subbies as well. If we're talking, if we want a subby to use the tool, you've got to put it in their contract at the beginning. Otherwise, they're going to come back asking for something.
And that's an interesting one. Generally, they don't. We'll spend a lot of time working with, because we'll get taken up on a project that's halfway through. So there's no
Yeah.
contractual requirement on the trade to do it. And in those situations, one of our team will generally go and meet with every single subcontractor and go through with them the benefits to their own business. And 90% of them will willingly adopt it because they see the benefit. And this is the carrot or the stick. That's the carrot. Then the 10% is the stick. Just do it or you don't get paid. But they, as much as possible, as an industry, we want to be avoiding that. Like, I think quality has been used in the past and is very easy to use as a benchmark for whether people have done work on site and should be paid, which is that stick approach. And my fear with that is always that it will force people to do things incorrectly just to get paid.
So what's your view on payment on completion of checklist?
I still
Well,
think
because I have seen it work.
I still think it should be done. Like I think you contract administrators should be assessing what quality has been completed and raising that as a red flag. Immediately, it becomes particularly difficult where it's used to hold payments back. It should be monitored far enough in advance that it doesn't become that point, but it should definitely be a part of the process, because at least that way it's the monthly cash to say, well, this trade hasn't done any quality this month, and they're complaining, they're claiming 70% complete through works in this area, and there's no quality records. Well, in that situation, you've got a whole payment. You've got to go and have the conversation and educate them. But ideally, we've had the conversation before that point.
But conversely, if they've done the work, if they've done 70% of the checklist and they're claiming 70%, they should be safe that they're not going to get assessed on that 70% because they've done the work and got the checklist.
And they've got the evidence. It's all there. It's clear.
You've got the photos, it's in, it's done. It gives them a level of security in terms of getting paid at the end of the period.
That's exactly right. And that's why you'll have subcontractors that adopt platforms like ours so that they can clearly demonstrate work that they've completed and they've done it in accordance with the documentation.
Yep. Okay, I've only got one more question. From a handover perspective, from a client perspective, not your client, but a constructor's client, what's the view in terms of giving clients access to the system or giving them handover records at the end or at the end of separable portions? Is there a rule on that, or does it tend to be a kind of client by client?
We're called Visibuild for a reason. Like, our dream and vision here, right, is complete visibility. And we have situations like that where we will have clients that have complete visibility over the entire construction quality process, and that is including what every single subcontractor, consultant, supplier, and the head contractor themselves does. We have situations where clients will mandate this. We have other situations where general contractors will willingly give their clients access to the platform so that they can, it's a competitive advantage. Like, how do we demonstrate that we are doing quality in a better manner than others had previously? And we're pretty strong on this vision in that I've delivered plenty of projects where the only quality update I gave to our clients was in a PCG every single month, and I said there were no non-conformances, and everyone was happy and they moved on. Whereas that's changing now, and we've seen it with insolvencies in the industry. We've seen it with clients really starting to care more. And so again, perfect world is complete visibility through the project, but we're also conscious that that's not always achievable on every single project. So there's varying degrees of where this can be achieved. There'll be some projects where the client's really particular about a certain element. They might be really particular about concrete pours, waterproofing, whatever it is, based on lessons learned they've had previously. Let them see that live through the process. Give them the confidence that you're doing the process correctly when they're doing it, because then they're going to be off your back. We've got the other side where sometimes it's a government project and the expectation is that they don't look at it throughout the project, but they need a complete data dump at the end. And so I guess from a platform perspective, we don't really have any objection to any of those processes. You can get your information out at any stage and we can download it into a cloud server of your choice at the end of the project. But from an industry perspective, and like why we're here as part of groups like this today, is we want to encourage complete visibility. I think people shouldn't be scared to show what they're doing, because the more people that look at this, the more opportunities there are for improvement. I think where people do get concerned about visibility is that they're going to have some external party micromanaging them. And we as a group need to discourage that behavior in the industry and only encourage those behaviors. It's going to result in better quality projects, because then ultimately, if the subcontractor delivers a better quality project, they're not coming back for warranty claims down the track. The general contractor is not having to deal with warranty claims and insolvent subcontractors who have gone under because they've built it poorly and now they've got to wear the warranty. And the client's not having to disrupt whoever is now occupying that space to come back and fix legacy issues.
Yeah, so I'd imagine it's important at the beginning of each project to understand what the client wants and when they want it, how much visibility they want in process, and or when they want their dumps of information, i.e. at the end of a particular building or the end of the entire project.
You look at the infra space, which has been better at that, of having pretty specific handover requirements for lots. And then you look at the commercial space, which has been less sophisticated from that degree, but in my opinion, are now becoming more sophisticated, because clients would actually say, we don't really want you to hand this over monthly. We just should be able to see it while it's happening. And it's becoming more normal.
And I guess with the insolvencies in the business, in the industry recently, clients are worried. At least they can see things being completed progressively and signed off progressively. They get a sense of assurance that the work's been done to the requirements.
That's right. And again, it helps with that claim. The subcontractors, we're expecting them to submit their quality work to do their claim, and the clients are unfortunately starting to do the same thing to general contractors. And
Okay.
it's reasonable. But we've seen it. We've seen the number of insolvencies in the industry, and we're dealing with a number of insolvencies in the industry now where we're having to hand data from one contractor to the other. And as long as those tri-party and correct contractual agreements are in place, it's actually a pretty painless process for everyone involved, other than the unfortunate company who's gone under. But
Yeah.
for everyone else involved, at least they can get going with the project and we don't end up with any more waste.
At least they know what was done and what wasn't done in terms of what's been signed off.
That's right. Because otherwise they end up having to go and tear things apart. They can't certify works and you end up with a lot more waste in the industry. And all that does is drive costs up and make everything harder and harder to build.
Okay. Okay, look, we're running up against time now. Has anyone on the call got any questions for Damien and myself? No? Okay, so recap. So it's important to have senior leadership backing for digitalization, but also to consider bottom up what the end user wants. Standardization. So there's some standardization should be possible, but you need to allow projects to customize their own forms so they can
You
do
want
it.
to encourage it.
You want to encourage it so then they own it because they've changed it to match their project. You need to be hardware agnostic. You need to understand the process. Uh, anything else? Take
I
home?
just had one quick question,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, Dane.
Yeah, with regards to, so when you're setting up the system, are you setting it up with sort of higher level ITPs and then you're linking checklists within that for specific activities? Is that how you
This is
how
the
you
this
check?
is the never-ending debate
This is the
between the
question.
ITP and ITC relationship. And our good commercial friends down here in Melbourne seem to think the ITC is the ITP, but I won't dig too deep into that. It depends on the project. Yes, we will have some that will have a formal ITP process which will identify the requirements. They will then link an ITC to that and complete the works. We will have others that basically do the ITP process effectively without realizing they're doing it through the review process to set up their inspection template relevant to the project. And then effectively they're just completing ITCs from that point forwards. But both is the answer.
Is either one of those more successful that you've seen today?
I don't mind either of them because they're both encouraging you to make the ITCs project specific. My understanding is that the formal ITP process isn't an expectation of Australian standards anymore, but having a specific ITC to the works that's relevant to the works is still the expectation there. So as long as project teams are considering and making the ITC specific for the works and specific for that project, then it's okay. The risk is when it is a standard boilerplate template that they use on every single project, no matter what, the template ends up being it's too vague. It doesn't cover enough information. It's not specific for the project, and it's less likely to catch those potential issues or educate users on what they should be doing.
But historically, there used to be an ITP that didn't get signed off, and then the checklists are what got signed off. And then we moved into a place where we sign off on the ITP. And in building, it tends to be very checklist driven, and in infrastructure, it tends to be very ITP driven. So that tends to be the way it sits
And
up.
we're in the middle now too. We're finding like, particularly with like data centers that straddle this like infra and commercial space, we've got both.
Yeah.
Very formal ITP arrangements and very formal ITC arrangements.
Yeah. And we would have like a detailed ITPs for something like waterproofing, but for drywall, we'd have a checklist. So it's about designing the system with enough capacity to go complex on high risk activities or to go simple on lower risk activities.
And the key thing that I would consider is, yeah, don't overcomplicate it where it doesn't need to be overcomplicated. Where you can, because that's when you start to lose trades and they everyone freaks out because it's too hard. As long as we can make the process simple for them to build what they need to build, then it'll be successful.
So keep your checklist simple, only things that need to be inspected, photos where possible.
Focus on where the risk is. Like, where is the risk with these piece of works? And that's what a good ITP should identify. It should break down the specifications, identify the risks. Those risks then get documented as part of the process to ensure that they're identified and closed out.
Keep it simple. Any more questions? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for being on the webinar. The recording will be on the CQA website by the end of the week. And thanks to Damien for presenting today.